Hello, everyone. Welcome all to the Other Talk with Brendan Kiely. Before we jump in, I just want to give a quick overview of the evening. Ada Fitzgerald, Main Street Books owner, and I, Beth Helfrich, events manager here, both have a number of questions for Brendan, but you are also welcome to add your questions and comments to the mix at any point during the evening. We will try to get to each of them before we finish up, which should be right around 9 o'clock. We really want this to be a productive and fruitful conversation. So feel free to put the questions that mean the most to you into the chat. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our featured guest, Brendan. He's the New York Times bestselling author of All American Boys, which he co-wrote with Jason Reynolds, as well as Tradition, The Last True Love Story, The Gospel of Winter, and most recently, The Other Talk, Reckoning with Our White Privilege. His work has been published in over a dozen other languages, and he has received the Coretta Scott King Award the Coretta Scott King Author Honor Award, the Walter Dean Myers Award, and ALA, American Library Association's Top 10 Best Fiction for Young Adults. A former high school teacher, he's now on the faculty of the Solstice MFA program. He's also an avid basketball fan, a big reader, and a dedicated partner and father. And he is coming to us tonight from New York. Welcome, Brendan.
Thanks so much. I love how you amended the end of my bio. That was brilliant.
Just a little, got to keep it a little fresh, right?
Yeah, good. I love it.
So I'm just going to jump right in, and it might be a strange place to start, but I actually would like to start by asking you about the inner conflict that you experienced when you set out to write the book, which you actually address in the author's note, which comes at the end of the book. Sure. Because I think that conflict is something that many folks here in the room might also wrestle with. Can you just share with us tonight that inner conflict as a way to get us started?
Sure, thanks. I appreciate that. No one has asked me to talk about that in any of the events so far to great length, so I appreciate the question. Also, I want to say, as a point of clarification, if I don't speak about this clearly enough, that I hope people will check out an interview that Renee Watson, the author Renee Watson, and I interviewed each other in Publishers Weekly, and she brought this up as well. And so it's a place to go because we're talking about her book, the picture book version of the 1619 Project, and the other talk. And I say all that to say that I really struggled with whether or not I should try to tackle this project. And I want to just give a little bit of context that Jason Reynolds, a Black man from Washington, D.C., and Brendan Kiely, a white man from Boston, became friends while traveling professionally, but at a moment in time in our lives when there was quite a bit of media about police brutality in the news. It was shortly after George Zimmerman had been acquitted in the murder trial of Trayvon Martin. And there were, to put this into context about why I'm going to talk about white privilege, while we were traveling, Jason's mother, a Black woman from South Carolina, who has the psychological, emotional, and physical scars from Jim Crow racism in America, calls her son to say, "I'm afraid. I'm terrified for your life because I'm worried there might be a George Zimmerman out there for you." Now, my mother loves me. I love my mother. I'm grateful for our relationship. But of course, she doesn't have that same fear. She has no cause for that same fear. And that recognition of those two realities began a conversation that Jason and I were having about the kind of talk that he often got, an evolving conversation he got with his mother while growing up about how his racial identity played a role in his life, and how growing up, despite the conversations of racism that I had in my family growing up, none of them were asking me to address my own racial identity as a white person and how that impacts my life and the lives of others around me. When writing about racism as a white person, I am troubled by what I am sure to be the case, which is that I will always be more ignorant than I will be wise about racism, because my privilege has so coddled me and protected me and kind of warped my worldview in many ways, that I'm nervous to embark on writing a project like this. I'm also nervous to embark on a project like this because of the vast number of folks of color, folks of the global majority, Black folks, Indigenous folks who have written about racism and whose voices have not been championed or trumpeted loudly enough. And yet, I also think that it is incumbent upon white folks like me to not hide in our silence, but to vocalize and to be honest about the impacts of privilege in our lives. So I struggled with all of this, and I struggled mightily with trying to get through draft after draft for years. While after Jason and I started talking about it, but in the wake of George Floyd's murder in the summer of 2020. Jason and I found ourselves talking about it again. And quite honestly, he said, when are you going to write this book? The white folks need to talk about their privilege. And as he and I discussed many times, one of the real obstacles to addressing structural, systemic, institutional racism is often that white people aren't able to talk about their own proximity to the problems themselves. And no matter how well-intentioned they are. And so I said, I realized instead of trying to be right, I just need to be honest. And so I put down as quickly as I could and as heartfelt as I could, an honest draft that was flawed, that showed how flawed I am as a human being, and tried to lay that out on the page, and then and get out there and get friends to take a look at it, and begin to point out how I can help tell what I want to tell in a better way. So thank you forgive me for a long answer to that question, but I really appreciate you starting this off like that, because nobody else has asked me to, in some ways, check myself first. And I deeply appreciate that.
Hi. So for all of you out there, I'm Ada. I own Main Street Books, and I'm really, really honored to be here tonight with Brendan and with those of you in our community who are here. Thank you so much. To follow that, let's talk about whiteness and white racial identity. We're of a similar age. You write about growing up around white adults who didn't necessarily deny racism or shy away from acknowledging racism, but who also never talked about whiteness or our racial identity, which really resonated with me, and I think Beth too. Turns out, not feeling like you have a racial identity is a pretty clear marker of white privilege. So why is owning our whiteness critical in racial justice work?
I want to share an anecdote and walk backwards from that anecdote as a way to answer your question, because I love this. I love that you're not just asking questions that are like the promo for the book. So thank you. And sorry,
we're just going to jump in.
Yeah, I love it. And so what I'm going to share an anecdote that comes near the end of the book when I'm talking about as a high school teacher. I worked in a high school in New York City for 10 years. And near the end of my time teaching, my school embarked on an anti-racist project. It received a grant. It had the idea was to do a documentary film with a multiracial cast of students from the city, and also construct a curriculum around the documentary. And the process of this anti-racist project, in fact, was deeply structurally racist in that the construction of the project was devised mostly by a few white men. And not only did they design the project the way they wanted it to look and feel, but when they started getting feedback from educators of color, they began to say things like, well, we can't really do that because this is how we've already set it up. And we're not listening at all. I share that intro to that because as I began to recognize as a participant in the curriculum committee what was really deeply wrong, and trying to offer support to some of the faculty of color who were really voicing their problems with the project, I kept essentially saying, yeah, what she said. Yeah, what she said. Yeah, exactly. I've got her back. And at a certain point, one of my friends and colleagues turned to me and some of the other white people in the room and said, I have to trust that you're going to say what I'm saying when I'm not in the room. Otherwise, how can I trust you at all? And I believe that that's a way to begin to answer your question about owning up to our own whiteness as white people, because I don't think I can talk about wanting to address issues of racism in my community, whether that's the inequities or the that come out of deep segregation, say in the public school system in New York, without first addressing what it means to begin to call, name, and maybe begin to interrogate my own participation in the privilege that perpetuates and doubles down on that racism that segregates schools, for example. I don't think that it's upon us to do all the work, but I think it's upon us maybe first to begin to call out ourselves. And that's what I'm trying to, I think that's how I'm trying to structure how a family might engage in, a white family like mine might engage in the other talk, a way to begin to tell our stories more truthfully and begin to address that white racial identity in a way that challenges us, as opposed to saying the problem exists out there, which is, to the beginning of your question, I think that's how racism was explained to me growing up. Let's blame it on those bad actors of history. Let's blame it on those bad actors in other places, or that one terrible real estate agent that, is down the street. Well, why haven't you participated in a march to get that agent fired? There's a lot to do that, and not blame others. And I think the beginning is maybe interrogating myself and looking at how close I am to those problems themselves.
I just, without belaboring it too much, because you do it justice in the sort of the biology justice in the book, but as a former high school and middle school science and biology teacher, I am I think one of the critical pieces in sort of owning whiteness is understanding what whiteness is. Can you give us a good way of, like a 12-year-old's explanation of
yes.
What is whiteness? What are we even attaching ourselves to biologically even?
Right. And I agree. Right. So I think we talk about this so often. We talk about race. Well, we should talk about it a lot more in general in our country. But race is a social construct. It is a sociological fact, not a biological fact. And I think a way to begin to talk about that with younger people too is to begin to say there are ways in which people who had power, rich people who were, judges or in roles in government or in, high operating powerful positions in their community, could maintain power and maintain that power with a smaller number of people if you begin to group people in a certain way. And race was one way to do that. As I think probably many people on the call here have heard Ta-Nehisi Coates talk about how racism is the father of race, that you have to have racism first before that constructs the concept of race. And I really appreciate that way of describing it. It's a way of talking about how power linked with prejudice or bias is racism. And you can wield racism as a sociological power tool over other people in your society. It's well documented. The American Association of Biological Anthropologists has a lengthy paragraph that outlines their definition of race, which basically boiled down to is this is a legacy of European colonialism across the rest of the world. And there's a reason why scholars and writers and educators like Tiffany Jewell and Montessori for Social Justice talk about people of the global majority, because people who do not identify as white constitute approximately 80% of the world population, whereas people who identify as white constitute approximately 20%. To think about the power that is in the hands of that 20% is exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about the why a system, a concept like race would be constructed to consolidate power in the hands of the few at the expense of the many. And that's a problem. So it's not as if there's actually any biological white person. Instead, what I am and what other folks who identify as white are people who have access to identifying to that group who has access to that social power. And I think if I'm to interrogate my whiteness and my white privilege, then what I need to do is I need to start breaking down some of those walls that protect me and shield me within that social power, i.e., having direct conversations with people in my school community about what elements of racial inequity are we reinforcing in this school system right now, i.e., in the hospital system, what ways have we created more avenues so that, in particular, Latinx and Hispanic folks who statistically are the most afraid to enter into the healthcare system in America because of fear of discrimination and or the repercussions of potential deportation for themselves or family members, how do we address that? And someone like me, I can ask that question when I go into my doctor's office in a way that the person who's afraid can't. That's how we begin to tie the theoretical part of your question to the action that folks like me can do. And what I want to talk to my child about as what I think is our responsibility is to not pass the buck anymore, but to say, this is who I think you can be in this world. I want you to care about math. I want you to care about how to do grammar in English class. I want you to care about compassion. And I also want you to care about how deeply rooted structural racism is in our society, and that it's your responsibility to try to do something about that. Again, forgive me, I'm long-winded. That green tea is hitting me, forgive me.
Well, that actually, you've teed me up well here for my first very personal question. And I know you're not a parenting expert, so I'm not seeking your total parental advice, but I am curious about an issue that I'm having in my own house. So my oldest, I've got 5 kids. My oldest is 13. And these are, we talk about race regularly. We're trying to, wrestle with our whiteness and our proximity to power and what that means, and when we need to trouble the narrative and provoke and ask the questions. And my 13-year-old now is accusing me of ruining everything, because when you trouble the narrative, when you poke and investigate, racism is so insidious in our history. It's so insidious in our present day that it comes up a lot. Columbus Day just happened here. They were still calling it Columbus Day. Right. At school. And so she had a pop quiz on Christopher Columbus. She said, "Mom, you hate Columbus, so I failed the quiz. Thanks a lot. You've ruined that. Thanksgiving, ruined it." Very trends that are ultimately cultural appropriation. Mm-hmm. We talk about it. Mm-hmm. It's ruined. And this is her word. And I know that some of it is jest because she's 13, right? But my question is more, I'm grateful for your book, because sometimes these conversations don't hit the same roadblocks as they do when it's your own kid. Yeah. And this was not the developmental pushback that I was anticipating. I thought it was going to be about, hair color or something else. And here we are. I'm getting a different reaction than I would have hoped for from my own kid. So my first question is, are we going to be okay? Is this going to land? The more we talk about it, even if in the moment, sometimes she's resistant. And then secondly, and this is maybe the more serious part of the question, and I wanted to ask you about listening, because that's something that you write so well about later, but how can we enter these conversations with our kids in a way that doesn't cause them to bristle? and allows them to engage and push for deeper understanding without them just saying, well, that's terrible, it's not my fault, and now it's ruined.
Yeah. I'm piecing together the different parts of your question, and one thing I want to share first, just as a sort of overarching umbrella for those of us who are adults in this room right now, to think about when, with regard to our responsibility to talk to our children about race and racism, and especially as folks who are white like me. There was a moment recently in Traverse City, Michigan, where there was quite a lot. There was a community sort of at odds with each other about whether or not there's CRT in the classroom, and there was a moment where there was. It's a predominantly white community. It was a very predominantly white school, and a few of the students of color in the high school explained and shared with other members in the community some moments of racism that had deeply affected them. And there were white kids in the school who essentially said something to the equivalent of what you're saying, which is, why do we always have to talk about race, or like this? Why does it always have to come down to this, et cetera, et cetera? And one of a young woman of color, high school student, said, if I'm young enough to experience it, then you are young enough to talk about it. And I think that, various memes of that kind have traveled across social media, but it hits really home when you hear a young person say that and have to stand up for herself in a situation like that. And I hear voices like that in my head whenever I'm speaking with someone who doesn't want to listen right away, because again, I hear my former colleagues saying, I need to trust that you're going to say it when I'm not in the room. I hear that young woman saying, if I'm feeling it as I'm growing up, then you're young enough to talk about it as you're growing up. And this is not my parenting advice. I cannot speak to anything about this, but I, at this stage of my own parenting, am bristling is a part of the deal. And in many of the stories I share in the book, there's a lot of bristling between me and my father, for sure. And I think it's okay in the long run, because while my father and I were not necessarily friends in the moment, I think we learned a lot from each other in the long run. And it's why our relationship is so strong now. And to step away from that, because again, I'm not a parenting expert, and to get back to the question of race and having questions about race and racism with our families, especially if I'm a white parent of a white child, like it is in my case, and they are reluctant to want to have that conversation, I think it's incumbent upon me to start as early as possible, so that it's an evolution. So I'm not just starting at a point where the time I choose to bring this up is they feel excluded from the party. That's obviously, no 13-year-old doesn't want to attend the theme party if that's what it is. And I'm saying, well, this theme party is kind of racist. Maybe if I can begin these conversations as early as my son is now, as a toddler, there are ways in which the evolution will support itself as we continue. I think there are ways to have conversations with children as well that also always ask them to tell their stories first. This is true, I think, maybe with people of all ages, that people want to share their story or how they're feeling when you're going to have a conversation about something uncomfortable. And I think it's okay to give people a little bit of space and then say, now can I tell my story that I want to share? And to use that as a way to both be vulnerable, so that instead of just saying, you can't go to that party because the party's racist, I don't know why I'm coming up with that example, except that I'm thinking about too many theme parties that adults still have these days. And instead, if I can say, hey, I feel a little uncomfortable about the setup for this. I know you really want to go. Can you tell me why you want to go, so that I can, and then I can tell you a little bit about why I don't want you to go. I think there are ways to have those conversations that can be productive, so that it's always about how are we in relation to the other people in our community, not this person's wrong and this person's right, but how are we and especially if I'm talking about myself as a white person and I'm talking to my white child about racism in the community, how am I and you related to each of the characters in this story? Because I think that helps a person begin to build the sense of accountability and ownership of the moments that are racist in a way that is empowering and not dismantling to their social psyche.
Thank you for a really elegant answer to a messy, inelegant question, and for allowing for the space for getting through the mess.
It is messy. Because I also don't want to, I can't not think of the many children that I have spoken with across the country. Another one that I bring up in the book is there's a young Black girl in a predominantly white school in Maine who asked me a question about empathy, and the subtext of her question, though, that she was asking to me, but I heard it as well, that she was asking students and probably adults in her community, was, why won't you believe me when I tell these stories? What will it take for you to believe me that when you act this way, it hurts? Or when you say these things, it hurts? Or when you ignore this truth about our history or our today, it hurts? I hear her voice in my head all the time, and I think, how dare I not stand up and try to say something to the people I'm closest with when that young woman has the courage to say so in front of her whole community? How dare I not muster the courage to say something? I don't mean to sound, now I sound sort of bristling, but or adamant, but that's, I think, part of the accountability. I think that her courage is the kind of courage that we have seen throughout the history of the United States, with predominantly from folks of color, but also of some white folks too, who have been standing up for racial justice. And as Renee Watson said in the interview that you linked to in the chat, which I appreciate, she as a Black woman talks about history as a record of hope, that she is the product of hope. And so for a white person like myself, who's interested in a fairer world, how dare I not have the courage to honor that hope of all those previous generations and the people who've done that work before me? Let's have the courage to at least talk.
Thank you for that. So moving in a little bit different direction, one of the more powerful moments in the book is when you realize you actually have a great deal more in common with a white supremacist than you would have first thought. Can you tell us that story and your takeaway?
Sure. So I mentioned this before, and for anyone on the call who's not familiar, I mentioned traveling the country with the author Jason Reynolds, and Jason Reynolds and I co-wrote a novel together called All American Boys, in which a Black boy and a white boy who go to the same high school are in ways connected to a moment of police violence that deeply affects the Black boy who is a survivor of that violence, and deeply affects a white boy who witnesses it and whose father figure is the perpetrator of that violence. I share all that to say this. So Jason and I have traveled the country together talking about that book quite a bit. And we traveled to Madison, Wisconsin to talk about the book there. And in that community, as often happens after he and I do an event together, what happens is that the student body kind of breaks up into naturally forming affinity groups. And many of the students of color gravitate towards Jason to ask him questions, and some of the white students gravitate towards me to ask me questions. And I have some other stories about white students gravitating towards me that I think are also important, but the one you ask about, I think, is really important for other white folks on this call, and to hear me talk about a recognition I had about good intentions versus my proximity to some of the part of the problem. And so at the end of this affinity group breakout, naturally forming affinity group breakout, there was one 17-year-old white young woman who was waiting to speak to me, and I could see the anger in her face. And she kind of pointed at me with a trembling finger, and she said, Brendan, you're not one of us. You're not really white because you're not white on the inside. And it was such a scary, terrifying moment because, first of all, that doesn't mean anything. That's not a thing at all. But second of all, to be so deeply rooted in those beliefs is quite terrifying. My first thought, though, of course, is like, who is looking out for the students of color in the school when she cannot be alone? This is a scary moment. Also, what the heck are the gun laws in the school? I mean, this is a terrifying thing to grapple with. And as she went on and sort of spouting some of her, textbook manifesto white supremacist crap, the thing in my mind that I was doing is I was distancing myself from her, and I was saying, man, I really hope that there's nobody out there who would look at her and me and think we were of similar mind in any way. Like in what I realized was she was distancing herself from me, saying, I don't want anyone to think that you are like me, and I was distancing myself from her, saying, I don't want anyone to think I'm like you, in this way. And I began to reflect on other experiences that Jason and I have had, for example, traveling the country together, the ways that in which I was immediately invited and assumed to belong when I walked into a school, a bank, a bookstore, an airport, how safe I was when I sat on a gun in a Uber in Louisiana, and the Uber driver started immediately sort of dropping racist coding right away. Whereas had I been a woman of color in particular, or people of color in general, in any of those other situations, how different it would have been. And it occurred to me as I was trying to distance myself from that white supremacist that she and I actually shared so much in common with the privilege of access in so many moments of our lives, access to safety, access to a sense of belonging, access to the assumption that we belong, access to our dignity. When Jason Reynolds and I, forgive me for using these examples with Jason so many times, but there are so many that come to mind so quickly. But he and I walked into a bank in Washington, D.C., and I share these anecdotes in the book too. I try to use as many real narrative anecdotes as possible in the book to try to bring this to life and not just speak about it abstractly, because I also think that's the best way to speak with young people in narrative, not abstraction. But he and I walked into a bank, and Jason's the client. Jason goes up to the teller, asks the teller, I got to do this business. And the teller says, for a transaction like that, I have to get the bank manager. She goes back to the back office, gets the bank manager. The bank manager, a white man like me, walks into the lobby, walks right past Jason, sticks his hand out to me and says, how can I help you, sir? Dismissing the dignity and humanity of Jason, first of all, in the room. As Ralph Ellison writes in Invisible Man, constructing a moment of invisibility for Jason in the room. And I had access to my full dignity in that moment. I had access to all those senses of belonging. That white supremacist and I all too often share those privileges. That means I am more like her in that I experience life like her in more ways that I'm comfortable with. And that for me was addressing a greater realization of what white privilege, another way in which white privilege manifests itself. And another reason why I am accountable to the harm that she publicly admits to wishing upon others, that I should be, if not literally, at least metaphorically somehow, part of that first line of defense to block her from doing so. And I may not be able to do that in that school in Madison, Wisconsin, as I hope some of the white teachers in that school are, but I can do so in other ways in the community that I'm closest to, here in New York City, back home in Massachusetts, in conversations or actions with my own family. That's where that work can be done in a way that is, I think, recognizing how darn close I am and how scary it is to admit I am to that white supremacist in Madison. I obviously am too long-winded. Thank you for that question.
Well, I will just to speak to your stories and your choice to use these narratives to make this as much memoir as it is, instructive. So, I mean, any more than ever, especially in our community in Davidson, my white kids are surrounded mostly by other white kids in their public school. And so, to be quite frank, like your stories of walking into a bank with Jason Reynolds, like my kid's not necessarily walking side by side through the world with anyone that's not white. I mean, occasionally, but we're a very segregated community and county. And so I think that's, it's really important to have those narratives, because they do open the door, open doors and windows for readers, right. Young readers. So,
and that experience that you're speaking about for your children does not reflect the greater demographics of our country. And I think, and there was an article in the New York Times about this too, about why talking about race and racism is incredibly empowering for children of color, because it cuts off the kind of normal noise of gaslighting that white media culture and white adults often do by trying to say, like, well, don't talk about that. Instead, by talking about race and racism, it's at least as sociologists have researched, it's empowering for young people of color, because they can hear, yeah, what I see with my own two eyes. Yes, we can actually talk about it, because that is the reality that's out there. And for young white kids, it's also empowering, because it gives them a language for something either that they have not been introduced to yet, but, and they can begin to be introduced to the reality that everybody else around them sees. Or if they do recognize it, but they've been taught to be silent about it, it's empowering because it begins to give them access to, but wait, I can talk about this too, in a different way and with a great deal more humility, but I can certainly begin to engage in this conversation and not shy away from it, or make it harder for others who are already trying to have it to continue to have it. So I really appreciate your acknowledging that in your own community, because that certainly was also the case in mine growing up, and in a microcosm becomes so because of segregation in New York City as well. And so it's an important thing to address and talk about, quite frankly.
I've got one more question, but I want to invite folks who are here with us in the room. Please drop some questions into the chat so that we can start to get to some of the questions that are bubbling up for you all as well. You talked about just a minute ago equipping our kids with language, and one of the threads that you keep coming back to in the book is the connection from language to attitude to behavior, and this sort of train that's one thing leads to another, and it had me thinking about, even this week in the headlines, there was just a ruling in a very prominent murder case where the judge has ruled that the word victim is not allowed to be used to describe the victims of murder. And so can you just talk about the importance of language as the starting point for all of this?
Yes, and I really appreciate the example that you brought up, because that speaks to the point precisely, right? And I'm going to step back and take it from a slightly different angle, because part of the way that I've been thinking about this is informed by a lot of the thinking and research that I did for my previous book, which was my fourth novel, which is called Tradition. And it's a young adult novel that is grappling with the kind of old boy culture at a boarding school, and the kinds of threats that some of the young women in the school feel on a daily basis. And I was thinking a lot about some of the experiences of my own life growing up as a boy, and then research I did at schools, a number of boarding schools in the country. And I was thinking a lot about how that kind of locker room talk, that language creates an atmosphere in which people start to say it's only a joke, or doesn't mean much, et cetera, et cetera. But when it becomes so pervasive, it infiltrates the attitudes in ways that lead to further graffiti, or, oh, it doesn't really matter if we, start passing this magazine around the locker room, et cetera, which leads to behavior. Language affects attitude, attitude affects behavior. And again, plenty of sociological study done about this as well. And so if you walk it backwards, a way to begin to address some of the behavior is to begin to address some of the attitude or address some of the language itself. And so constricting or not allowing for appropriate language to be used in a courtroom for something as horrific as murder is damaging for the attitudes that will be perpetuated throughout the rest of that case, and therefore the behavior that comes out of that in some way. And speaking of which, I learned a lesson about the word murder, unfortunately, while I was writing this book, in which I couldn't use the word murder in a couple of the cases in the book because, for example, if someone has been acquitted in the murder trial of Trayvon Martin, I can't say that George Zimmerman committed murder from a legal perspective. That said, we can still talk about it with specifics. And forgive me for, I don't mean to speak about these horrific moments with any kind of carelessness or callousness. I'm trying to demonstrate the power of language. And so to mention killing, to mention a victim, those are real words that can be used, that are not tied to any legalese. And that's what the power of language is about. So if we arm our children, if we arm our young folks with the language of justice, if we empower them with the language of having agency in conversations about racism, if we arm them and equip them with the language of accountability and responsibility, our young folks can enter into conversations about racism in meaningful ways. And their language can help, I think, buoy an attitude, a sense of, I belong here, first as someone who listens. That's something I really want to make sure we express in this conversation. There are 5 chapters in the book that are about listening, because listening comes first before action and attitude and everything else. Especially as a white person engaging in conversations about racism, I need to listen to the truth of folks of color. But just like that young woman in Maine was saying, but if we can empower our young folks with that language, that will inevitably lead to behavior that helps further dismantle the inequities of structural racism. And trying to rob our young people of it, or silence them, or keep them away from it, is I think beyond cruel. It's also it's reinforcing the very power that we were talking about in the beginning for why race was constructed in the first place. And if that doesn't bring me close in proximity to white supremacy and power, then I don't know what it does. I have got to find a way to get that language out there as much as possible. And so one way to do that is to try to talk about it within our families.
I'm going to ask again for our audience who's being very quiet. Are there any questions?
I'm actually a nice person.
He said he's open to answering any questions.
Yeah.
I have one that's like very kid and parenting oriented. While we wait, do you have media that you like to recommend that's like really, let's say middle school oriented, but parents aren't gonna that would just be good for provoking conversation, but be accessible?
Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, my media of choice is to recommend some other books, and I that's where I feel most comfortable speaking about it, especially because I'm thinking about so many other books that are out there that are trying to generate these kinds of conversations. One that I think of off the top of my head is a book it's an anthology that's edited by Cheryl and Wade Hudson. It's called The Talk. And I think what is so fascinating about what's so fascinating about The Talk is it approaches, I mentioned earlier this kind of conversation that Jason Reynolds and I had about the talk he had growing up as a young Black man with his Black mother. But there are many different kinds of talks that may inform a whole variety of readers about, folks growing up in East Asian immigrant households, or Latinx households, or conversations that are intersectional about race and gender identity, or sexual orientation, to frame just how intersectional, to use a big word, but maybe interconnected the various parts of our identities are to access and power and humility and ways of participating in our communities, or ways in which we feel like we're not able to participate. And so that's one of the resources that I always recommend first, because it's so wonderfully diverse in a real full sense of that word. I love everything. I mentioned Renee Watson before, and one of the reasons why I love Renee Watson's work is that I think that many conversations can come out of the stories that she writes, because she is not didactic in any way, but she's writing from a place of real heart and compassion. So I would recommend the Renee Watson catalog. I would recommend Frederick Joseph's The Black Friend, in which he's sharing, similar to the way I read his book after I had already worked on mine. But what I love about his book, and what it really made me think quite a bit about that, sort of the anecdotes that he shares in his life about being a Black person in a variety of situations. It helps frame conversations in the same way that I hope this does, right? So forgive me, one of you mentioned earlier that it's sometimes hard to start these questions with your own family, like, what did you do, or what are we doing, et cetera, et cetera. Well, an easier way is to say, well, take a look at Brendan Kiely, take a look at what he's doing, right? And like, I have thrown myself under the bus. I demonstrate moments in which I did things that I'm now mortified that I have done, but I want to put them out there so that others can do better and learn from it in a way that I didn't know what I didn't know at the time. So now that I know just a little bit more, may I please share this with you so that you can know a little bit more before you're in a situation like I was. Those are a couple of resources off the top of my head. I also really recommend Tiffany Jewell's book. This book is Anti-Racist, which is right here. Tiffany Jewell's book, This Book is Anti-Racist, I think is an excellent conversation starter. It even has kind of like little worksheets, and there's a follow-up book to this that's with the word journal in the title, and forgive me, I don't have that off the top of my head, but both of Tiffany Jewell's books I would recommend highly. So that's a place to start for some media as conversation starters that I think are really quite powerful. I think if you're an adult and you want a conversation starter as an adult, and you're white, I would recommend Tim Wise's White Like Me, which is a book that had a profound impact on me a long time ago. And I also would recommend two organizations for everybody out there, whatever your professional role is. Your institution can incorporate professional development in some fashion. And there is an organization called the Institute, the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. The People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, run undoing racism workshops. And when I was an educator, I attended some of those workshops, and they were transformative in the way that I began to think about how racism works, and really transformative in the way that for me to begin to think about how I need to address my own white racial identity. The other organization, it used to be called Border Crossers, and it's now called the Center for Racial Justice in Education. That's their name because they primarily offer workshops for educators. However, they also run workshops for families. And this is why I'm bringing it up to answer your question. They run workshops that are kind of immerse yourself, kind of almost role-playing type workshops, where you're sort of thrown into some uncomfortable conversations, and you have to work through it, and you try and fail, and as ways to sort of test that out a little bit before you maybe have to do it in real life. I highly recommend those two organizations. I mentioned them in my list in the back of the book. The back of the book has a much longer list than I just mentioned of other resources and blogs and places to go for information and conversation starters. So please take a look at the final pages in the book, where I talk about who I've tried to listen to and learn from.
I just want to share a comment from Joy, who said it really resonated with her when your statement that you need to be honest more than you need to be right, and feeling some understanding of that fear, being silent because I'm aware or afraid that I'll be insensitive or wrong about something and make things worse. Sometimes I take that risk. Other times I shy away from the risk. You write about a number of situations like that in the book. And earlier you talked about building the muscle. So I didn't know if you wanted to just talk about that a little bit more.
That's I first of all, thank you for that comment. And thank you for mentioning why that resonated with you, because I think there is such a fear for so many people, and in particular for so many white people, to enter conversations about racism, because they know darn well they're going to be wrong, and that's okay to an extent. I don't want to pass the buck and say that doesn't matter. No, it does matter. We have to be closer to right than wrong more often. But ways to do that is to listen more, a lot more. And I think we can learn to be more honest. Somebody asked me a question at an event last night about how can you learn more about the privileges you don't know you have? Well, it's really hard to learn more about what you don't know, honestly, unless it's pointed out to you. And so I think ways of building the muscle of being more honest is to, and I really appreciate this as the cue up to speak about this, is to listen a lot more first. Listening can take many forms. Listening can be when, as a white person, if a colleague of color is taking the risk to share a story that is about racism in some way, not saying, "Oh yeah, I know what you mean about that," or not dismissing it as, "Yeah, that was just a one-time scenario," or yeah, but instead taking the time to actually actively listen, because in those moments I may suddenly see myself as a character in the story, even if I'm not the one that person is talking about. Right? By way of analogy, I remember the shock I had in 10th grade English class when I was reading Frankenstein, the novel. And if anyone's read it or seen one of the movies, you know that there's a scene when the creation is running free and doesn't understand the world yet, and runs into a village, and the villagers are wielding their pitchforks and torches and calling it names and chasing it out of the village. And I remember reading that in class and having this sudden shock and looking up at Mr. Riley, my 10th grade English teacher. And he was like, "Brendan, what's the matter with you? You look like you saw a ghost." And I think he was joking because we were reading Gothic literature. But I said, "Yes, I'm terrified." And he said, "Of what?" And I said, "When am I one of those villagers? When am I the one chasing someone out of the room? it was such a powerful moment for me to think about how I could do that in the cafeteria as a kind of cocky basketball star. How I might do that in ways at a party when I wasn't paying attention to someone who was uncomfortable. And likewise, as an extension of all this, when talking about and learning about and listening about racism in America, how often I might be one of those people who's pushing the stories and the truth of folks of color and experiences of folks of color out of the metaphorical room. And I don't want to be that person. So in order for me to do better, I have to work on the muscle of listening first. It may not be that I'm in situations as, we were speaking about earlier, but that means I have to go seek them out. And so media, as you were saying, watching as many movies as possible, changing the television shows that I watch so that I'm not watching any more TV shows that are predominantly white casts, so that I'm no longer reading, I'm predominantly reading books that feature characters of color or written by scholars of color. I think it's essential to do that. I'm a white guy and I'm a writer, but I want all white folks out there to be predominantly consuming media produced by folks of color. And that's the way I think it should be. And that's a way to also listen and work on that muscle.
I love that connection to listening. And we didn't direct one question at this concept of listening and empathy, but I did want to just say the way that you write about it reminds me of something Brene Brown once put out, just a brief little video, and she was talking about our filters that we walk around with. So we've got our perspective, and we just can never take them off. We can never actually shift our perspective to really see something from someone else's perspective. The only thing we can do is listen to people's stories and believe them. And that's the second critical part, right? Is that you have to believe what they tell you about their experience in order to have any empathy.
I really appreciate that, because that's chapter 19.
There it is.
The other talk, literally, about the power of choosing to listen, but then the second piece, then choosing to believe. I mean, it seems, and that's what that young woman in Maine was saying. Why won't you believe me? What will it take for you to believe me? I want to encourage us to choose to believe her and the many young folks and folks who are younger at heart and their stories.
I've got one more quick question here, and then we'll wrap up. This is from Brenda. Brenda has 2 teenage grandchildren who now have a Black stepfather. She says, I believe they often experience surprise or shock from their peers, as in, who is that? Do you have any recommendations for them?
That's a difficult question for me to answer, to be quite honest, because I feel like I could be stepping way outside my bounds here with regard to dynamics in the family and the community. So forgive me, I'm not gonna dodge. I am gonna provide an answer, but I want to be very careful about how I answer a question like that, because I appreciate the question very much. Absolutely. I mentioned in the book I do a sort of case scenario of what it's like when white folks like myself are asking people, particularly say of Asian or Latinx descent, or we don't even know a person's racial identity, and we're asking them questions like, where are you from? Or when did your family get here? Or these kinds of somewhat loaded questions that are otherizing in ways that assume some sense of normality from whatever my life experience is, and assume that otherness of somebody else. I mention that because in that section in the book, I begin to ask if there are ways that we can ask other questions. And I wonder if in this situation, the family, well, first of all, I just feel like I would speak to the Black stepfather and ask what he wants. Let's speak to the person first. But I also think that there are ways in which we can, as white kids talking to other white kids, arm them with ways of, instead of the shock or the surprise or the awkward question that comes, asking a question back about, what if you asked this instead? What if you asked why we love them? What if there's another way to lead in, and obviously it's hard for young folks, 13 years old, talking about love is not the first thing that they're going to want to talk about, but there might be, well, how about like, what's the funniest joke that he's ever told? There are ways that we can begin to reframe a conversation, I think, that shift the questions away from otherizing. And I think that's something that white folks really need to do, because as the Montessori for social justice folks would remind us, that if anyone's an other, it's us. And so let's get away from that kind of language, because it doesn't do us any good, and try to empower the young folks maybe with ways of reframing those questions. That's a hard question to answer, and I don't think I did it justice, but I would recommend reading that section of the book, because I know I go through a couple of other examples.
We are out of time. I first want to say thank you to everyone who has come tonight and spent this hour with us. It's been such a treat to have you in conversation, Brendan. And I know that I speak on behalf of Ada when I say thank you. Thank you for the book, which we have available. You can see right here. If you walk into the bookstore and straight to the back, it's sitting right here on our YA nonfiction rack. And before you go, I just have to ask my last question that I ask every single person. What are you reading right now?
Oh my gosh, I love this question. Okay, so I have a couple of books that I have handy because I'm reading them for two different reasons. One, I'm also still an educator. I teach at the Solstice MFA program in Boston, and so I'm reading the Anti-Racist Writing Workshop, because I'm trying to think a little bit about, again, interrogate some of my own practices. What am I blind to right now? And another thing is, I did an event for School Library Journal's Day of Dialogue with Crystal Fleming, and so I just started reading her book Rise Up, and I totally recommend it. It's awesome. I also am in conversation with middle grade author Tracy Baptiste. And so I don't have it handy because it's upstairs, but I'm reading her for very young middle grade book, African Icons, about 10 people from Africa who have changed the world. Those are books that I'm reading right now. I read many books at the same time, as my bio says. And and I just have kept this mentality from school days. You're always juggling different classes and different books. So I'm reading all those books right now.
To speak really quick, to follow up on that, sort of examining your blind spots in the classroom and considering all of the backlash about critical race theory, are there any texts that educators might read to help sort of navigate the?
Oh, there is a Facebook Live talk that is now on YouTube that is led by Bob Kim, Kim, Cassandra with a K Minor, and Cornelius Minor. Cornelius Minor and Cassandra Minor are both educators who are deeply involved in social justice in education, for lack of a better phrase. They would say it much better than I just did. And Bob Kim is a lawyer, and they gave an excellent talk. It's available on YouTube right now, about how to begin to address and support discussions about racism in your classes while under the threat of that kind of anti-CRT. And please listen to their wisdom. They're much more steeped in it than I am. And they did a lot of work to put that presentation together. They really address all the loopholes, because it's a political sham. All these attacks are, there was an article in the New Yorker about this summer. There's one person from the Manhattan Institute who was like, I have a really good idea to, instigate, get out the vote for Republicans in the 2022 elections. And one way to do that is to do race baiting like they always do. And it's well documented. I'm not speaking out of turn. It's well documented. The problem is that it put a lot of fear into the hearts of and minds of teachers, but factually, there actually is a lot of room to still do all the stuff that you've been doing all along. So it's important to listen to that talk and feel empowered. That said, I know that there are plenty of communities in which, regardless of the loopholes, the cultural barriers at work are too immense. And so I would reach out to those educators and ask their advice. Cassandra and Cornelius Miner and Bob Kim. I also would recommend, again, going to that website, the Center for Racial Justice and Education, because they're aggregating resources for this as we speak. So I would go to them.
Awesome.
Brendan, one layer of this, because this question has been seconded and then thirded in the conversation, which is, what recommendations do you have for white parents who want to support teachers and administrators who are having conversations about race in their classrooms? So sort of how do parents lean in or support that? Well,
without knowing the context, I don't want to suggest action without first listening. So it seems really important to network first, to community build, to say, I really would appreciate being able to support your work if you want to talk about racism in the class. How can I be supportive? What is it? What are the obstacles? What tools can I help provide? Whatever the case may be, but to go ask the people who are the sources of that information. I think that is the place to start, and to not come in with a plan, but to come in with a sense of readiness and willingness to help, even if it's something that suddenly is like, oh shoot, that's uncomfortable now. But they said that's how they need the help, then that's what we need to do, I think. I think that would be a really helpful way to help the teachers in the classroom. The last piece I want to say too about resources for teachers and how to lean in and support as a volunteer is that there is an organization. Forgive me, I'm going to pull the book out because Bettina Love is another educator whose the organization is called the Abolitionist Teaching Network. If you are educators out there who are listening to this talk, I would reach out to the Abolitionist Teaching Network. I would support them in their work, support Bettina Love and her work, and I would support their efforts to try to, again, aggregate best practices and whatnot right now. There are people who are doing this work in New Mexico. There are people who are doing this work in Anchorage, Alaska. There are people who are doing this work in, up and down the Eastern Seaboard, finding ways to get to organizations like that are aggregating some of this best practice knowledge is the best that I can offer, because whatever they have to say, they're going to be much more brilliant than me with that very specific professional question, which I appreciate. And I too just want to help. So can I also say that for all of you who are listening, my social media handles are open. If you have more questions, or if you find something out that is informative, so that if I have a platform like this somewhere else and you think that I should share what you've learned, please let me know, because I want this to be a collective effort. This is not a solo effort by any stretch of the imagination. It should be about us and we. And so, my social media door is open. My home door is closed because I want to protect my child. But my social media door is open.
Thank you so much. And yes, now Dr. Glass is saying yes, Abolitionist Teaching Network is wonderful, and Dr. Love's book is great too, calling it life-giving. Thank you for these recommendations. I believe Ada was making notes. Is that right, Ada?
I was pulling up the tabs.
She's got all the tabs open. Perfect.
Links.
Yes, so we'll try to pull together some of these resources so that we can send them out to you all later this week. But in the meantime, this is an exceptional resource for you, for your family, for your kids. It's a really lovely, accessible introduction to all of this stuff. And so, Brendan, thanks for working through those doubts and getting it out there into the world.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone who's here listening and who had to jump off. And really, thank you so much, Beth and Ada at Main Street Books. Thank you. I really appreciate you carving out the space and supporting the book.
Yeah. Have a good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Good night, everyone.